Hello, today I'll take you to Louisiana, USA, a place that has witnessed many shocking events. Baton Rouge, the largest city in the state, is located in the southern part of the country and is known for its rich history and vibrant culture. However, behind its beauty, Louisiana has also been the scene of many mysterious and tragic stories. On the morning of September 16, 2010, in the state of Louisiana, a woman named Susie Fleniken realized that her husband, Greg Fleniken, hadn't responded to her calls for an unusually long period of time. Greg Fleniken was a businessman working for a natural gas company, and he frequently traveled for work to handle issues related to mineral rights and gas royalties. On the evening before his disappearance, Susie had texted her husband and received an immediate response from him. The next morning, Susie couldn't reach Greg anymore. The relationship between the couple was strong, and they always called each other each morning before Greg started his workday on business trips. However, after multiple calls with no response, Susie contacted her husband's colleagues to ask about his situation. But the co-workers said he hadn't come to the company yet. With no other options, Susie asked them to check the hotel where Greg had been staying. The upscale hotel that Greg chose was located in downtown Beaumont, Texas, USA. Two of Greg's colleagues then went to the hotel together and asked the manager to use the spare key to open room 348, where Greg had been staying. When the door was opened, everyone was horrified to see a person lying motionless on the floor. His body was stiff, his skin pale, and he still held a burnt-out cigarette in his hand. This indicated that Greg had been dead for quite a while. The TV in room 348 was still on, and the room was extremely hot and stuffy. Both colleagues then confirmed that the person lying on the floor was indeed Greg. Given the situation, they quickly called the police. Upon receiving the call, the police promptly arrived at the scene to secure the area. By around 11 a.m. that same day, after being notified, Detective Scott Apple from the local police department promptly arrived at the scene. During his inspection, he noticed that all the belongings in the room were undamaged and there were no visible injuries on the victim's body. Greg's head lay on the carpet near the door with a partially smoked cigarette still between the fingers of his left hand. His cell phone, wristwatch, and some snacks were neatly placed on the bed. There were no signs of any struggle or altercation at the scene. According to the victim's wife, Greg was a longtime smoker who had never gone for a health checkup and had no interest in sports. However, with his many years of experience, Detective Scott felt that there was something unusual about this case, different from any other he had handled. Given Greg's age of over 50, it was initially believed that the situation could be a case of sudden death due to illness. The next day, Greg's body was transferred to Jefferson County, Texas, for an autopsy. Susie, Greg's wife, sadly packed up her husband's belongings and shared that if he had died suddenly, it might have been a painless death. However, the situation was not as simple as she thought. During the autopsy, forensic pathologist Tommy Brow began examining Greg's body and discovered two wounds. The first wound was on his left cheek, a scratch approximately 1 inch long, likely caused by impact when Greg fell to the floor. The second wound was located in the genital area, a small tear less than 1 inch long, surrounded by some light bruising. However, none of these injuries were severe enough to explain the victim's death. Nevertheless, when Dr. Brow examined the internal organs, he made a shocking discovery. Greg's entire intestine was torn, resulting in some undigested food spilling out. Additionally, his liver and stomach were severely damaged, and there were two broken ribs on the right side. Greg's heart, especially on the right side, also showed a large tear. The victim's entire internal organs had become a chaotic mess, and even experienced forensic pathologists rarely encountered such horrific internal injuries. Dr. Brow concluded that to cause such severe injuries, the attacker must have had extraordinary strength or used an extremely dangerous weapon. In the end, he filled out the cause of death on the death certificate, stating that Greg died due to being attacked by a foreign object. This was truly a puzzling case, making both the doctor and Detective Scott feel doubtful. After all, there were no signs of a struggle or any major commotion in room 348. The attacker hadn't left any suspicious marks on the outside of the victim's body. According to his family and colleagues, Greg led a very simple lifestyle, with his greatest pleasures being smoking and watching TV. No one could have imagined that someone would act so cruelly toward Greg in such a way. With many questions raised, Detective Scott decided to re-examine the entire case. After reviewing the events that took place in the hotel the previous evening, he noticed a suspicious detail. Around 7:30 p.m., Greg had used the microwave to heat up a bag of popcorn. In his hotel room, there may have been some voltage issue that caused the electricity to be lost in both rooms 348 and 349. Greg then called the front desk to report the situation. The hotel sent a technician to address the problem. By 8:30 p.m., the electrical system had been successfully repaired and both rooms returned to normal. According to surveillance footage, Greg did not leave the room for even a moment from the time the power outage occurred. Detective Scott then came up with two possibilities. The first possibility is that the electrician may have been experiencing some fatigue at work, leading to a conflict with Greg. In a fit of rage, he may have attacked Greg. The second possibility is that the people in room 349, a group of young men, were gathering to drink. They may think that the sudden power outage was caused by Greg and that it ruined their fun, leading them to vent their anger on Greg. Scott then interrogated those involved, and they seemed only surprised and curious, with no other reactions. The hotel repair technician and Greg had only met for the first time that night. According to their statements and the hotel manager, everything went smoothly with no conflict at all. The people in room 349 were local electricians who had also never met Greg. There were no traces of a third person entering the room. The surveillance system only recorded footage of Greg entering the hotel that afternoon. So, where exactly was Greg attacked with such severe injuries? How could he have made it back to his room? After months of investigation, the case still showed no progress. Detective Scott also couldn't understand what had happened to Greg that night. In February 2011, 5 months after the incident, the police still hadn't found any new clues. Greg's wife, Susie, was devastated and couldn't accept her husband's unjust death. Therefore, she spent a large amount of money to hire a private investigator to reinvestigate the entire case. The detective Susie hired was named Ken Brennan. He was a former police officer who had solved numerous cases and had been featured in many prominent magazines in the United States. After meeting with Susie, Ken immediately asked a series of detailed questions about Greg's work and personal life. After investigating the hotel scene, Ken noticed several suspicious details. First, Susie mentioned that when Greg's colleagues entered the room, they found the air stuffy and the air conditioning off. However, Greg usually disliked the heat and would always turn on the cold air conditioning whenever he stayed at a hotel, so this detail seemed a bit strange. Ken then asked Susie about her husband's smoking habits and specifically whether Greg used his left or right hand to smoke. Susie replied that Greg was right-handed, so he typically held his cigarette with his right hand. Once he had these two answers, the detective, known for his logical thinking, quickly began to reconstruct the scene of the crime. On September 15th, the night of the incident, Greg had placed his favorite sweet treat on the hotel bed, smoked a cigarette, and watched television. At 7 p.m., he received a message from his wife, Susie, and replied immediately. By 7:30 p.m., Greg opened a bottle of Coca-Cola and began to heat up popcorn. This action caused a sudden power outage. He immediately called the hotel to request repairs. By 8:30 p.m., after the electrical system had been repaired, Greg resumed watching TV and smoked a cigarette. However, as he had smoked about half of the cigarette, an unexpected incident occurred in Greg's room, resulting in severe internal injuries to his body. Because he could not shout loudly, Greg tried to move outside to ask for help. But when he reached the position near the door, he could not bear it any longer and passed away. Ken believed that Greg had died due to an incident occurring in the room, with this conclusion primarily based onto answers Susie had given earlier. First, Beaumont's summer heat is intense and Greg always feared the heat. By 7:30 p.m., before the power outage occurred, the air conditioning in the room was surely turned on. Typically, the room temperature would stay cool for a while. Therefore, when the repairman finished his work, it's possible that Greg had forgotten to turn the air conditioning back on. Additionally, when discovered, the cigarette was in Greg's left hand, not his usual right hand. Only his fingerprints and saliva were found on the cigarette. Based on the position of his body lying on his side, there is a high possibility that he wanted to use his right hand to open the door and ask for help, so he switched the cigarette to his left hand. All of this indicates that after the electrical system was fixed around 8:30 p.m. and before the room's cool temperature faded, a sudden incident took place. Over the past few months, the police repeatedly examined room 348 and confirmed that there was no trace of anyone else in the room besides Greg. Therefore, the investigation mainly focused on the possibility that the victim had been attacked in a different location outside the room. Although this seemed hard to believe, Ken's reconstruction of events was very convincing. This not only resolved the issue of the lack of evidence at the scene, but also provided a logical explanation for why Greg collapsed onto the rug near the door of his room. It's possible the victim wasn't attacked outside the room at all, but rather something within the room itself had quickly led to his death. Thus, all suspicions began to focus squarely on the room. A new approach emerged with police collaboration. Ken launched a fresh inspection, meticulously examining every corner of room 348, revisiting each spot in the room repeatedly. He also searched thoroughly for any areas that might hide special mechanisms, yet found nothing. He then questioned several hotel staff members involved to gather additional information. That night, Ken and Detective Scott compared statements, but after a week of hard work, they had no promising results. In May 2011, Ken, along with Detective Scott, approached some local electricians' union workers to see if they had any information about the individuals in room 349. Most of the respondents knew about the incident at the hotel, but the information they provided was based on rumors and was inconsistent. One of them even said flippantly that he heard the incident involved a gun. Scott felt skeptical, thinking it was nonsense, but Ken didn't feel the same way. He listened carefully and asked a few more questions, as he couldn't yet determine exactly where this information had originated. However, the force of a bullet can indeed cause rapid destruction within the human body, and this sparked a new lead in his mind. That afternoon, Ken returned to the room and re-examined the walls and floor, searching for any signs that could lead to the cause of Greg's death. Eventually, Ken shifted his attention to a small hole behind the door. This wasn't the first time he had noticed the hole, but because it appeared to be the mark of a doorknob hitting the wall, both he and the police had overlooked it previously. This time, Ken specially pushed the door knob against the wall, but discovered that the door knob did not hit the position of that small hole at all. Ken then quickly moved to the adjacent room, number 349, and found a small hole filled with toothpaste in the same position on the wall. Ken continued to use a laser pointer to examine the area and discovered that the two small holes in the two rooms were connected, with the laser light shining directly onto the spot on the bed in room 348. After comparing them, Ken concluded that the small hole was indeed a bullet hole, raising new suspicions about Greg's death. This discovery could prove that Greg was not attacked in his own room but may have been shot from the adjacent room. Ken decided to investigate further to trace the origin of the bullet and uncover what really happened on that fateful night. Since the body had been cremated, verifying the victim's condition to identify the perpetrator became challenging. However, Ken realized that in order to change the initial conclusion of the forensic examination, they needed to locate the bullet. He contacted Dr. Brow, who was responsible for examining the body. Previously, the doctor had always concluded that Greg had been attacked. However, as they closely reviewed the images from the initial examination, Dr. Brow discovered that the wound on the lower abdomen had been identified as a 0.6-inch tear, which could possibly be the mark left by a bullet passing through. Because the skin in this area is soft and the wound had previously contracted, the doctor initially believed that the tear was caused by being kicked with a pointed shoe. However, after reviewing other images, Dr. Brow realized that the tear near the heart was actually a bullet hole. Although Greg had been cremated, the story was gradually becoming clearer. With this new information, Ken and his team had grounds to carry out a more in-depth investigation into the incident, focusing on individuals who might be involved in the case and uncovering their motives. That night, as Greg was lying on the bed watching TV, a bullet from room 349 pierced through the wall and entered his body. The bullet passed through Greg's organs and ended up in his heart, a very rare position. Because of this, investigators initially didn't suspect it and concluded that he had been attacked with a sharp object. After gathering more information, the police conducted a thorough investigation of those who had stayed in room 349 on the night of the incident. Before long, they focused on an electrician named Lance Mulla, who had been staying in room 349 initially. Lance denied any wrongdoing, but after a strategically led police interrogation, he ultimately revealed the truth about what had happened that night. On the night of the crime, Mulla and his friends bought some cans of beer and gathered in room 349 to drink. After drinking too much, Mulla began to show signs of being drunk. While showing off the gun in his hand, Mulla accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting a bullet through the wall into the next room. After the incident, the group did not dare to immediately check the next room but stood close to the wall to listen for any unusual sounds. After hearing no suspicious sounds, they used toothpaste to seal the bullet hole and hid the gun in the car. Then, the group went out to find a bar to keep drinking. The next morning, upon hearing that someone in the neighboring room had died, possibly from a stroke, Mulla realized that the victim might be connected to his gunshot. However, he still tried to convince himself that he had nothing to do with this incident and tried every way to erase the feeling of guilt weighing on his mind. In the time that followed, Mulla quickly quit his job and left the city of Beaumont. Throughout the entire interrogation process, he never showed any signs of remorse. He repeatedly told the police and lawyers that the tenant of room number 348 was attacked by someone, not by his bullet. Fortunately, Dr. Brow dared to face the risk of losing his profession due to media criticism and changed Greg's cause of death to gunshot wound. By September 2012, Mulla was finally sentenced. Beaumont is not a large place, and such a bizarre event has never occurred here. Throughout the trial, numerous reporters from across the country gathered at the scene. Greg's wife, Susie, wept continuously in court and asked Mulla how he felt seeing Greg's body wrapped in a bag on the morning it was discovered. However, Mulla did not answer and just bowed his head to the ground, not daring to face the crimes he had committed. Although the incident was merely a coincidence, when considering Muller's intentional act of using toothpaste to cover the hole and obstructing justice by hiding the gun, it all reflected a very dark behavior. Finally, this astonishing case came to an end, with the Beaumont court sentencing Muller to 10 years in prison. After Muller was convicted, Ken invited Detective Scott to lunch with him. The two people then told about a detail that made them suspicious during the interrogation process. On the night of the incident, Muller had hidden the gun in his car. The hotel supervisor mentioned that Muller returned to the hotel after a night out with friends, and they could still hear the sound of the neighbor in room 348 coughing. This detail added further complexity to the case, suggesting that there might still be hidden aspects of this incident yet to be uncovered. From this perspective, the time of Greg's death might have been entirely misjudged by the police and forensic doctors. It's possible that Greg lived far longer than expected, enduring excruciating pain in his organs that prevented him from calling for help and instead forced him to use all his remaining strength to inch slowly toward the door. At the last moment before opening the door, Greg had no idea what had happened to his body. If the person in the next room hadn't been drinking and carrying a gun, if the hotel hadn't lost power, if he hadn't been lying down watching a movie but doing something else, perhaps the tragedy wouldn't have happened. However, in life, there aren't many instances of what if like that. You can never know what will happen to you in the next moments of your life, so cherish every moment. Today's video ends here, and see you again in the next videos.